The ridge should have been theirs. That's what the plan said, the map said, the weather brief said. But the mountain had other ideas. In less than 10 minutes, fog poured over the spine like a living thing. Radios went to static, and the enemy rose out of the rocks as if the hillside had been hiding them. The SEALs fell back to a razor-thin saddle. No cover, no time, and the only road down already bracketed by fire. Then a sound threaded the valley, low and metallic, a growl you feel more than hear. It rolled across the fog like thunder trapped inside steel. Someone looked up into the white. Someone else whispered, "That can't be." And the mountain answered with a scream that split the mist and carved the battle into before and after. Welcome back to the Storyscape. Before we dive in, I have to ask, where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments, because your stories, your perspectives, they shape the way we tell ours. And if this is your first time here, this is the place where we bring you cinematic, high-stakes stories of courage, impossible odds, and the people who stepped forward when no one else can. The ridge was a broken knuckle jutting out of a chain of darker bones, a place cartographers labeled with numbers and men remembered with scars. The approach began at first light, the kind of pallid gray that flattens distance and hides movement. The SEAL element moved up through scrub and shale, boots finding the rhythm that years of training imprint into muscle. Every step, a small promise to the person on your left and right. They were light, fast, and methodical. By 0640, they owned the crest. By 0650, the mountains started taking it back. It began with wind, slight at first, then a cross-cutting shove that twisted the fog the way a hand bruises water. Radios clicked and cracked, a mesh of call signs and clipped vectors. The Overwatch reported glints on the northern finger. A moment later, the glints grew muzzles. The first burst chewed the edge of a rock where Ramirez had just rested his cheek to glass the next ridge. He hit the ground, and the world went tight and loud. Return fire snapped down range like someone ripping linen. They were professionals. They didn't panic. They shifted, established sectors, and tried to pry space from the stone. But the enemy had tunneled into the hill with the patience of roots. Fire came from angles that shouldn't have existed, from gullies too narrow to hold a man, from the blind side of fractured slate. The fog thickened, masking muzzle smoke and movement, until every shadow had teeth. A disciplined withdrawal began, meters, not yards, bloodless at first, then costly. In the command vehicle far below, a controller stared at the uplink and felt the same cold helplessness he'd felt in another country, another year. He had air on call, but not the kind you throw at a maze cut into rock. Fast movers were overhead, sleek, supersonic, and wrong for this fight. The valley was a bowl full of broken glass. You needed something that liked to get dirty, something that could put its nose in the mess and not blink. He hesitated only once before he said the call sign. It felt like pulling a pin you'd promised you wouldn't need. Requesting immediate on-station, low-level, tasking Ghost Hog. The pilot roster showed a single status line, available, WX conditional. Weather conditional meant what it always did in mountains, a rumor of visibility, a chance at a gap, a pilot willing to thread needles other people can't see. On the ridge, the SEALs reached the saddle, a narrow strip of earth connecting two slopes like a promise that could snap at any step. The enemy had weight and angles. The team had grit and a countdown measured in magazines. Their comms cut through the static. Contact close, north finger, south draw, pinned. That's when the valley changed timbre. The sound didn't arrive so much as it revealed itself, as if it had been waiting inside the air and only now decided to stand up. There's nothing else like the A-10's voice, not for those who've heard it close up. It is part growl, part chisel, the audible suggestion of mass turning intent into consequence. It doesn't rush, it arrives. She came out of the fog nose down, not diving so much as curving through the mist like a blade finding a seam.
The Warthog looked indecently out of place, wings too broad, engines too honest, nothing sleek about it, until you remembered what mountains and close fights respect: stability, endurance, and a pilot who interprets terrain the way a surgeon reads a pulse. Her HUD was a ghost cathedral painted in phosphor green. Terrain warnings chimed. She silenced them like an old friend who worries too much. Ground speed ticked low, altitude lower, angle of attack in the sweet spot where lift listens and drag holds its breath. She had flown in air that moved like fists, in valleys shaped for ambushes, under ceilings that dropped without notice. This was a conversation she understood. The controller's voice reached her through a haze of static. She could hear the shape of trouble even when words fell apart. Ridge lost. Friendlies collapsed to saddle. Enemy entrenched north and south. She pictured it before the map populated. A knuckle ridge, a saddle, interlocking fire. She thought of how fog loves rock because both hold secrets. On her first pass, she didn't shoot. She mapped. The TGP licked the slopes with infrared, searching for texture that didn't belong. Heat where there should be cold. Motion where stone should be still. The enemy had tunneled, yes, but tunnels breathe, and breath leaves signatures. She watched for the faintest exhale. Below, a SEAL crawled his last magazine toward a teammate and thought, not for the first time, how ridiculous it is that trust can feel like a physical object, the kind you can pass hand to hand. He caught the sound of turbines fencing with wind and smiled without humor. Hog? He asked no one. No one answered because they were busy staying alive. Her second pass carved closer. The ridge's north finger sprouted a shape in the pod, dark against colder dark, the color of intent. She cued the pipper without changing the steadiness of her hands. The GAU-8 felt heavy and eager, a promise bolted into titanium. She squeezed, and the cannon's voice drowned the valley. It didn't sound like gunfire so much as a zipper, closing reality around a line the enemy shouldn't have crossed. Stone fountained. In the saddle, men felt the pressure wave in their teeth. On the north finger, positions that had believed in their own invisibility came apart. She didn't linger. She rolled with a deliberate indifference to altitude that would make most pilots pray and came back on a line that put her shadow directly over the south draw. Another squeeze, another sentence, written in tungsten. The fight changed shape. Fire that had been everywhere at once collapsed into panic and silence, those twin cousins that arrive when certainty dies. The SEALs felt space open, the rarest gift on a ridge. They took it with the unromantic speed of professionals who know how quickly gifts are revoked. They moved, not forward and not back, but through, cutting across the saddle, while her third pass stitched a curtain between them and anything that still wanted them dead. "Ridge, you are clear to push," came the voice in their ears, calm enough to be almost impolite. No call sign, no speech, just capacity. She banked into the fog again, a gray shape absorbed by a gray world, and for a heartbeat, the mountain tried to pretend she had never been there. But the rocks remembered, the air remembered, and the enemy, what was left of it, remembered most of all. On her kneeboard, a photograph of a different mountain, a different year, slid a millimeter under G-load and stayed. You don't always get to fix the first ridge you lose. Sometimes you fix someone else's and call it even. At the saddle, boots bit earth that was theirs again. The team leader didn't waste words. Set, push. They rose, lighter by fear and heavier by purpose, and the ridge that wouldn't hold felt its own spine stiffen. The mountain had other ideas that morning. So did she. And for a few long seconds, the kind that stretched lives in both directions, the Warthog decided which ideas would matter.
The call sign wasn't in wide circulation anymore. Ghost Hog had been spoken often enough in certain squadrons years ago, the kind of moniker that stuck, not because the pilot liked it, but because others needed a name to make sense of what she did. It had been earned in a valley halfway around the world,
where an entire convoy of friendlies had sworn they saw nothing but fog, right up until a Warthog tore through it and erased a column of armored threats like chalk lines and rain. No one ever claimed to see her approach. They only heard the departure, a low growl fading into nothing. That was when the name started to travel, carried on the lips of grateful soldiers and muttered by enemies who didn't understand how something so big could vanish so fast. By the time this mission dropped into her lap, Ghost Hog wasn't flying daily rotations. She'd taken a role that looked administrative on paper: training, simulator oversight, readiness evaluations. But everyone who'd flown with her knew that not on the roster didn't mean out of the fight. Her combat hours had carved something permanent into her, a mixture of precision and disregard for limits that didn't translate to spreadsheets. She kept her flight gear ready anyway. Old habits don't fade, they wait. That morning, the weather brief alone would have turned away most pilots. The ridge sat in a wind shear corridor known to slap aircraft out of the sky without warning. Visibility was variable. Military speak for you might see the target or you might see nothing until you're inside it. Even drones had trouble in this air. They lacked the instinct to read the subtle language of the terrain. She thrived on it. It wasn't recklessness. She hated waste, especially wasted risk. It was knowing that the margin for error was slim, but her margin for control was slimmer still, and she preferred it that way. She got the call just as she was reviewing simulator footage from a training run. The controller's voice didn't waste breath. He gave the essentials in one steady burst: seal element, ridge compromised, saddle holding for now, heavy enemy entrenchment north and south, weather borderline, requesting immediate low-level strike. Her headset caught the faint edge of urgency under his words. She'd flown with him before. He was one of the few who knew exactly when to reach for her name. "Send the grid," she said, already on her feet. The map coordinates dropped onto her knee pad as she strode for the locker. Her flight suit still smelled faintly of JP-8 and desert dust. She zipped in, cinched straps, and grabbed her helmet. There was no ceremony to it. Ceremony is for people with time. She had a ridge to take back. On the tarmac, the Warthog looked like it had been waiting for her.
Paint worn in all the right places. Shark mouth grinning in the morning haze. Twin engines muttering like impatient hounds. Crew chief handed her the final check slate, and she signed without hesitation. Pre-flight was muscle memory. Control surfaces, fuel load, weapons check. 2 AGM-65 Mavericks, hydropods, and the GAU-8 loaded to the teeth with API rounds, enough to cut holes in the ridge and anything clinging to it. "WX still garbage," the chief warned, nodding toward the mountains. She gave him the half-smile that had unnerved more than one ops officer. Garbage keeps them predictable. Takeoff was smooth until the horizon tilted and the sky closed in. Cloud banks stacked like dirty glass panels, visibility collapsing into pockets of light and dark. She dropped low, using terrain masking even on the Ingress, because if the ridge was compromised, so were the approaches. No sense advertising her arrival. The first ping on her RWR was expected. Enemy air defense radar trying to sniff her out. She jinked left, rode the contour of a slope, and let the mountain do the shielding. This was where the Warthog excelled. Sleek jets feared terrain this close. She made it part of the flight plan. Her mind worked the tactical picture with the detachment of a chess player. The seals were pinned on the saddle, enemy to both flanks, limited cover. That meant the fight was in a vice. If she took out one flank decisively and fast, the other would be forced to reposition, creating a gap. The SEALs could either push through or reset their perimeter, but either way, they'd own the ground again. 10 miles out, she could feel the wind shear start to play its games, buffeting the airframe in little shoulder checks. She countered with tiny corrections,
each one feeding back into her hands like a live wire. At 8 miles, the fog swallowed her, and the outside world became a vague smear beyond the HUD. At 6, she had visual on the saddle through the TGP, a thermal signature cluster, compressed into a too small space. At 5, the enemy positions began to bloom on the display, little ghosts of heat hiding under the teeth of the ridge. She didn't announce herself to the SEALs. She never did. They'd know soon enough. First pass, south draw. She lined the pipper, released a pod of hydro rockets in a staggered ripple, and watched the explosions knit into a wall of concussion and smoke. Enemy fire spiked and then faltered. She banked hard, letting gravity pull her into a low arc that kissed the tree line. Second pass, north finger. This time the GAU-8 spoke, its roar drowning the wind shear. Tungsten rounds chewed through rock and fortification alike, turning firing positions into craters. Her radio crackled with a voice she recognized, stripped of formality.
Saddle has space, we're moving. That was all she needed. She pulled wide for a third pass, partly to confirm the retreat of hostile signatures, partly because part of her wasn't ready to leave. She'd seen too many ridges lost for good. This one would not be among them. As the SEALs surged forward, reclaiming each meter of high ground, she thought of all the times she'd been too far away to change the ending. Not today. When she finally broke off, the Warthog climbed back into the fog as if dissolving into the mountain's breath. Below, the ridge was theirs again, and her name was being said over the radio with the kind of gratitude that can't be written into mission reports. She didn't answer. Ghosts don't have to. The instant the last burst from her GAA-8 faded, the saddle felt wider. It wasn't. Physically, it was still the same knife edge of dirt suspended between two killing grounds, but the air in the SEAL's lungs no longer carried the same weight. The sharp, panicked chatter of incoming rounds thinned to isolated cracks. The difference was enough for a team leader to make a decision without gambling lives. Push. The order moved like voltage down the line. No speeches, no rallying cries, just the unison of men who drilled this movement until their muscles didn't ask for permission. They rose, low and fast, rifles shouldered, eyes raking for movement in the mist. The south draw was still coughing dust and smoke from Ghost Hog's first pass, and the north finger lay under a scatter of fresh craters, jagged edges still shedding rock. It was the closest thing to a gap they'd get. Ramirez led the pivot, cutting into the saddle's left curve to flank the north position. Beside him, Cole dropped to a knee, firing controlled bursts into an angle that had chewed them up minutes before. Nothing came back. That silence was dangerous. It could mean the enemy was gone, or it could mean they were waiting. Neither man trusted it, but they moved anyway. This was the deal. You take the space when it's offered, even if it's a trap, because standing still is worse. The ground was ugly, slippery shale that rolled under boots, pockets of loose soil that swallowed a step and threatened to twist an ankle. Visibility shifted with each gust. Sometimes they could see 30 meters, sometimes barely 3. The fog curled low in the hollows and climbed in wisps along the ridge crest, snagging on jagged rock like torn cloth. Somewhere in that white chaos, Ghost Hog's engine note was fading, a reminder that air cover was never permanent. If they wanted to hold this ridge, they had to seal it themselves. From the southern arc of the saddle, 2 other SEALs, Harris and Dominguez, moved uphill in a stagger, watching for shapes in the haze.
They found them, a pair of enemy fighters, pale from dust and shock, one clutching a shoulder slick with blood. Harris gave a hand signal, surrender or finish. The fighters froze, eyes flicking between the Americans and the smoking ridgeline above. Dominguez's rifle didn't move. Eventually, one dropped his weapon. The other followed. Harris sent them back down the hill in the custody of rear security. The fight on the ridge wasn't waiting. The push hit resistance at the halfway mark. A burst of automatic fire stitched across a rock face to Ramirez's right, kicking up shards. He rolled behind an outcrop, scanning for muzzle flash. There it was, low, almost at ground level, a dug-in position masked by scree. He dropped a frag over the lip, counted 2 seconds, and ducked. The detonation sent a plume of dust sideways. When it cleared, the fire was gone. They crested the north finger in increments, leapfrogging forward, covering each other's advance. Every meter revealed more of the enemy's work. Narrow fighting pits, ammo caches tucked under stone shelves, and escape cuts that ran down the far slope like escape hatches. Some of the pits were still smoking from the cannon strikes, the smell of burned metal mixing with the mineral tang of the mountain. "Clear," Cole called finally, voice hoarse but certain. The north flank was theirs. On the other side of the saddle, Harris's element had been slower, meeting pockets of resistance where the Hydra rockets had churned the earth but left enough cover for desperate defenders. The fight was brutal in close quarters, short, savage bursts of fire, flashes of movement inside the fog, boots slipping in churned mud and grit. But the psychological edge was with the SEALs now. Every hostile they flushed had heard the A-10, had felt the mountain shudder under its strikes. That sound carried an unspoken message. We found you once. We can do it again. By the time Harris's men reached the South Ridge, the firing had become sporadic. The remaining defenders slipped away into the folds of the mountain, their retreat covered by the fog that had once been their ally. It was over faster than anyone expected. That was the nature of fights turned by air power. Hours of stalemate, undone in minutes by the right strike at the right time. The team regrouped on the saddle, weapons still up, scanning for counterattack. None came. Only then did the radio crackle, a voice from the controller below confirming what they already knew. "Ridge secure." Ramirez exhaled, only now aware of how hard his heart had been hammering. He looked up through the mist at the direction Ghost Hog had vanished. Part of him wanted to hear that growl again, to know she was still circling, watching. Another part knew that was the point. She wasn't here to linger.
She was here to tip the scales and disappear, leaving them to write the ending. Harris crouched beside him, pulling a field dressing from his kick to wrap a graze on his forearm. "You ever flown with her?" he asked. "No," Ramirez said, shaking his head. "But I've been under her." Harris snorted. "Careful how you phrase that." They both laughed, a rough, tired sound that belonged to men still alive in a place designed to make them otherwise. The ridge was theirs again, but no one mistook that for permanence. Mountains have long memories. So do the people who fight on them. And somewhere out in the gray, Ghost Hog was already heading back to base, the mission sealed in the quiet space between her and the ridge she'd given back. The ridge was shrinking behind her canopy glass, swallowed by the same white veil she'd used to enter. Ghost Hog kept the climb shallow, hugging the contours until the terrain dipped enough to hide her from any lingering air defenses. The A-10's engines thrummed at a pitch she could feel in her spine, a steady vibration that was both comfort and reminder. She was still in the envelope where one bad choice could make her a story someone else told. Her breathing had slowed since the last pass, but the aftertaste of adrenaline lingered, metallic, sharp. In the headset, the controller's voice came through. "Ridge secure, SEALs holding both flanks." It was the official end of her part, but she didn't acknowledge. Not yet. She kept scanning the TGP, letting it sweep over valleys and draws beyond the ridgeline, hunting for movement that didn't belong. She'd been burned before by clean mission reports that ended in body bags because someone assumed an enemy force was finished when it was only regrouping. At 8 miles out, she throttled back, letting the Warthog's nose dip just enough to mask her heat signature against the colder ground. The terrain here was rough, all jagged ribs and shadowed pockets. In some of those shadows, heat signatures bloomed faintly, too small for a vehicle, too scattered to be organized. Survivors, maybe. Stragglers. She marked the coordinates in case the SEALs needed to sweep later. The habit of overchecking wasn't in any manual. It came from a single day, years ago, when she hadn't. That day had followed her into every sortie since. She could still see the valley, the dust,
the single convoy vehicle she had missed because her exfilled time was tight and the weather was closing. It had carried more than she'd guessed. The news reached her in a bare, 2-line sitrap, 3 KIA. She'd memorized the grid anyway, as if remembering could change the ending. That was the day Ghost Hog stopped trusting Clear, until she proved it herself.
The egress route threaded her between 2 mountain shoulders, with a wind shear hit hard. The Warthog shuddered, but she rode it like a horse trying to test its rider. Loose where she needed to be, tight where it counted. She liked this part of the flight, the way the terrain felt close enough to touch, the illusion that she could thread her fingertips through the treetops. To most pilots, this was the dangerous part. To her, it was home. On the open comms, another voice cut in, tower frequency, tinny with distance. "Ghost Hog, you are RTB, code 7. She acknowledged this one with a curt double click. Return to base. No threats on the horizon, no changes to the loadout. She'd burn the rest of the fuel back home, let the crew chief scowl at her for keeping the engines at her preferred power settings. Her eyes drifted to the kneeboard, to the photograph wedged under the strap. The same one she'd carried on every combat flight since she'd printed it. Grainy, sun-bleached, a group of her first deployment team, laughing at something just out of frame. One of them had been at that ridge years back, before she'd even heard its name. He'd lost it then, not for lack of fight, but for lack of what she'd just given the SEALs. Air that could stay low, hit hard, and linger long enough to matter. The climb out brought her above the fog line. The world turned bright in an instant, the sun's glare catching the canopy in a molten sheet. She could see the peaks stretching out in all directions, blue-black against the horizon. From up here, the ridge didn't look like much, a thin line between slopes, indistinguishable from the hundreds of others. But she knew its weight. She'd felt it in the calls, in the urgency of the request, in the way the team leader's voice had cracked just once before going flat again. People think flying is about the machine, the skill, the adrenaline. They miss that it's about listening to the ground, the weather, the unspoken between transmissions. That was the part she could never teach in the sim. You could show someone how to put rounds on target, but you couldn't teach them to know why this target mattered more than the rest. She leveled off for the final leg to base. The radio stayed quiet, except for the occasional position check from other aircraft in the AO. She didn't join in. Her mind was already halfway between the ridge and the debrief room, running through what she'd seen, what she'd mark for the SEALs, what she'd keep for herself. Some details lived better off paper. Below, the mountain swallowed her shadow for the last time that day. In the distance, the airstrip shimmered in the afternoon light, a thin line of asphalt cut into scrub and rock. She lined up for approach, throttles easing back. The mission was done. The ridge was theirs again. And Ghost Hog, true to her name, would leave it without expecting anyone to remember her face, only the sound of her arrival. The ridge was quiet in a way that didn't feel natural yet. The SEALs knew better to trust it completely. Quiet could be a breathing space, or it could be the pause before something uglier. Still, the contrast from an hour ago was stark. No more tracer fire skipping along the rocks. No more ricochets whining into the fog. Just the wind sighing over stone and the low creak of webbing as men shifted their weight. Ramirez crouched at the edge of the north finger, scanning down into the gully where Ghost Hog's first pass had torn through. The impact zone was an ugly scar, pitted earth, shattered stone, the blackened remains of what had been firing positions. Even from here, he could smell the burned metal. He swept his optics along the draw and caught a faint movement, a loose tarp flapping in the wind, nothing more. He made a note to mark the grid for sweep teams later. Behind him, Harris's element was already moving methodically through the southern slope,
clearing what was left of the dugouts. They'd pulled 2 prisoners from the rubble, dazed and coughing, and sent them back under guard. The rest was debris and silence. Harris stepped into one of the positions, crouched, and ran a gloved hand along the interior wall. The cannon fire had chewed through it like paper. The fact anyone had survived in there was almost absurd. They regrouped at the saddle. The fog was thinning now, breaking into drifting sheets that revealed more of the surrounding peaks. Without the mist, the ridge seemed smaller, less mythical, but the men knew its tactical weight. From here, you could control sight lines into 3 valleys, cut movement along a key supply route, and spot inbound forces long before they reached the lower slopes. Losing it had been costly. Regaining it so quickly was the kind of outcome that didn't make sense on paper, but made perfect sense to those who'd heard that cannon's voice overhead. Dominguez knelt beside a shattered rock face, using a multi-tool to pry out a jagged slug of tungsten lodged deep in the stone. When he finally freed it, he held it up between finger and thumb, turning it in the light. "GAU-8, he said softly, almost to himself. Never gets old. Cole glanced over. "You gonna mount that over your bed?" Dominguez smirked. "Nah, pocket reminder." He slipped it into a vest pouch. They kept their perimeter tight, rifles up, eyes outward. But between sweeps, they spoke in low voices, piecing together the fight from different angles. None of them had seen her clearly, just a shadow in the mist, the flash of a canopy once when she banked low enough for the sun to catch it.
And the sound, always the sound. The guttural roar of those twin engines, the growl of the cannon chewing the ridge back into their control. Ramirez finally keyed his radio to the controller. "Tell her thanks," he said simply. "Static. Then, she's already RTP. You can tell her next time." Ramirez smiled without humor. "Yeah, if there is a next time." They dug in for the night, sandbagging exposed arcs, setting claymores along the approaches. Harris took first watch on the north finger, where the mountain dropped away into shadow. He leaned on the parapet, scanning the slope below, but his mind kept replaying the moment the fog split open and the Warthog came through. It hadn't just been firepower. It was timing, precision, and the willingness to fly into a space most pilots would have called suicidal. Up here, there wasn't much room for admiration. You respected what kept you alive, and you remembered it when the quiet returned. The ridge was holding now, but they all knew it was temporary. The enemy would try again. When they did, maybe Ghost Hog would be on another mission. Maybe not. You couldn't plan for it. You just held the ground, kept your powder dry, and hoped the mountain remembered who had claimed it last. By full dark, the fog was gone. The stars came out sharp and cold, scattered over the peaks like salt on black stone. Down in the valleys, faint pinpricks of light marked settlements or camps or something else entirely. The SEALs rotated watch, brewed bitter coffee over a tiny stove, and listened to the wind in the rock. Somewhere far away, an A-10's engines wound down on a quiet airstrip. No one on the ridge could hear it, but they all knew the sound well enough to imagine it. By the time Ghost Hog rolled onto the tarmac, the sun was sliding low over the horizon, staining the edges of the mountains in burnt gold. The airstrip was quiet, except for the dull whine of auxiliary power units and the shouts of ground crew moving between aircraft. She taxied slow, nose wheel following the yellow line like it was the only thing that existed. Her engine spooled down with a throaty sigh, and for the first time in hours, the world felt still. She popped the canopy and unbuckled, the metal of her harness still warm from body heat. The crew chief was waiting with the ladder, one hand on the rail, eyes flicking over the skin of the jet for any new scars. "How'd she fly?" he asked, though they both knew it wasn't small talk. She said, "She wanted to be there." He grinned, tight, respectful,
and moved off to start post-flight checks. The walk to ops was short, but it gave her just enough time to replay the fight in her head. The fog, the flanks.
The way the saddle had looked from above, compressed, dangerous, but still holding. She filed away the heat signatures she'd marked on the egress. Those would go into the report, flagged for follow-up sweeps. She wouldn't be there for that part. Her job was to make sure the ground guys got the chance to do theirs. Inside the debrief room, the controller who'd called her in was waiting. He had the lean look of someone who'd been on both sides of the radio too many times. On the table between them sat a printout of the ridge, before and after imagery. The difference was stark. Craters where fortified pits had been. Clear approaches where there'd been choke points. "You saved them," he said, not as a compliment, but as a fact. "I gave them space," she corrected. "They did the rest." They went through the formalities, coordinates, ordnance counts, weather deviations, all the numbers that made the mission real on paper. But the real story lived in the silences, in the things they didn't bother writing down. How the timing had been seconds away from too late. How she pushed through a crosswind that could have shoved her into the ridge. How the seals had moved like water into every gap she opened. When it was over, she signed the log, stood, and reached for her helmet. "You'll be on call tomorrow?" he asked. She gave a half smile. "I'm always on call, whether they know it or not." Back in the hangar, the Warthog was already half stripped. Panels open, belts of 30mm being unloaded, fuel lines hissing. She walked past her without touching her, as if they'd already said what needed saying. Outside, the air was cooling fast, carrying that clean, metallic scent mountains give off after the sun drops. She pulled the photograph from her kneeboard and looked at it one last time before sliding it back into place. Same crew, same smiles, same valley in the background. She wondered what they'd think of today, if they'd call it payback or just another ridge on another nameless peak. She didn't need an answer. Somewhere out there, the SEALs were digging in, owning a piece of ground they'd almost lost. Maybe they were talking about the A-10. Maybe they were just glad the night was theirs. Either way, she was fine being just a sound in their memory, a growl in the fog, a shadow with teeth. She headed for quarters without looking back at the runway. Tomorrow, another call might come, another ridge, another fight. And when it did, she'd be ready. Not for the glory, not even for the win, but for the simple satisfaction of giving someone else a chance to hold the line. That was the part nobody wrote into the reports, the part that kept Ghost Hog flying. Because sometimes, seconds are all it takes to change a battle. And all she's ever needed is a few seconds.